Thank you, my lady. Professor Smith, before the break we were discussing some of the information that was available in the early part of the pandemic about the emerging threat, and I'd like to stay in that area if that's possible. Could we have a look, please, at INQ 000273978? And I'm looking at paragraph 241. And you were asked some questions about some early email exchanges between Professor Mark Woolhouse, who's an epidemiologist at Edinburgh University, who was in contact in January and from then on with your predecessor, Dr. Calderwood. And you say there that I was aware that Professor Mark Woolhouse had contacted the CMO, Dr. Calderwood, and had seen the contents of an email which provided his view of a potential scenario. I was also aware that the CMO arranged to discuss this further with Professor Woolhouse, and though I do not know the content of those discussions, I recall her taking these assessments alongside information she received from elsewhere with a particularly significant gravity. And if I could just take you to an email chain and see if this is the chain. It's INQ 000352450. If we go to page 7 of this document, please. This is a series of emails all in a chain. Page 6. Yes, we could just go to the page before that to see the top of the email. So this is the first email in the chain, the earliest chronologically. If we could just go slightly above that, yes, we can see that this is an email from Mark Woolhouse. A bit further down, please, to the email below that. Yep. The one dated the 21st of January. Nope, further towards the end. So you can, this is an email. I'm looking at the email from Mark Woolhouse. You can see there's one dated from the top part of the screen, dated the 21st of January from Professor Woolhouse to your predecessor, although that's the CMO address. That was to Dr. Calderwood, I think. Is this an email do you think you would have seen or would have known about from discussions? This is the first in the chain, which starts to intimate some of the concerns that Professor Woolhouse had at that time.
So I certainly recognise the tone of the email, even from the read-through
yes.
that
I don't want, this wasn't to you, so I just want to be clear that it may be possible that the details are not, you're not entirely au fait with.
And I know both from this communication and other communications from Professor Woolhouse around about that time that he did have significant concerns in relation to the potential threat that this virus could cause even at that time, and the degree of uncertainty that still existed around about the potential that it did have.
Yes, just to be clear, he's a witness who's appeared on a number of occasions in the inquiry already. Professor Woolhouse is a consultant epidemiologist based in the Usher Institute at Edinburgh University.
That's right, yes.
And if we could have a look at the email, the bottom page that you can see there, the top passage, he says, the obvious concern increased by yesterday's not unexpected announcement of human-to-human transmission is that this will become a pandemic and therefore will affect Scotland. This is not yet certain, but in my judgment it is likely, certainly sufficiently likely, that we should be prepared for the eventuality. Other colleagues share this view. There are some instructive parallels with the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 to 10. Indeed, one possibility is that this could turn out to be quite similar in some key respects, a widespread epidemic fueled by mild cases, but with mortality among vulnerable patients. So at that stage, as you say, Professor Woolhouse's position in intimating his concerns to Dr. Calderwood is that there are still some uncertainties about the position, but that he considers that a threat to Scotland is sufficiently likely. Yes?
That's certainly my reading of his email and also the discussions that I was privy to at that time with Professor Woolhouse. And
I think what he is, a piece of factual information, if you like, rather than assessment or opinion, is that evidence had arisen the previous day of human-to-human transmission. that's referred to in the email?
So that was at the stage where it was just becoming evident that there was, rather than transmission from an animal source to human, that there was now evidence of distinct human-to-human transmission, i.e. the virus had now been able to evolve to an extent that it had the potential to certainly cause, at the very least, an outbreak, if not an epidemic or even a pandemic in human form.
Thank you for that. What I'm trying to highlight is that the evidence of human-to-human transmission is very significant in trying to work out the potential threat. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
Thank you. He also, and it's fair to say that this is much more at the state of possibility rather than likelihood, says that this could be an epidemic fueled by mild cases with mortality amongst vulnerable patients like the H1N1 threat had been. Would this tend to suggest, if the epidemic were to be fueled by mild cases, that testing, though an important part of trying to contain the virus, may miss cases as mild patients may not report to undergo a test?
One of the key considerations at this stage would have been to what degree can viral substance be obtained in order to develop tests which would identify with sufficient confidence that the virus itself could be identified, particularly if there were mild cases which could mimic many other diseases.
And in this email, he also raises the possibility of the severity of any ultimate epidemic in Scotland were it to arrive. Is that correct?
So I recall both within, I can read within this email,
yes,
but also recall within other correspondence
yes,
from Mark that he rose that it had the potential to do that, but again emphasised within each of those that there was great uncertainty about that.
Yes. It is fair to say that there's a degree of uncertainty. Certain things are expressed at the level of likelihood and certain others at the level of possibility. What I'd be interested in knowing is what the response was within your office, if you like, on behalf of Dr. Calderwood, and indeed what advice was provided to ministers to put this on their radar, if you like.
I would love to be able to answer that question for you with the degree of detail which I suspect that you're looking for, but I'm afraid that I wasn't sufficiently close to those discussions that you speak about, what that existed between Dr. Calderwood and ministers to be able to give you that with any kind of clarity. What I do recall from the conversations with Dr. Calderwood was the concern that she had that she was using this information from Professor Woolhouse to corroborate information which was coming from other sources and to try to gain a kind of a sense, a better all-round picture of exactly the degree of threat. I think she commits in this email chain to kind of taking that into further discussion with other CMOs where, again, it was recognised that there was a threat here which was certainly emerging and that threat was at that stage being fully assessed through the NERTAG, which is the appropriate committee for assessing the threat from emerging respiratory viruses.
Whilst it might be entirely understandable, as you are not the CMO at the time, that you are not across the detail of precisely what might have been said to ministers, are you at least aware of whether conversations took place with ministers about this threat at this time by
I'm aware of,
or others?
I am aware of the intention that she had, but I'm not aware of the timing of any of those conversations, I'm afraid. I'm afraid I would be speculating on those.
So she intended to convey it, but you don't know whether she did convey these matters either generally or specifically?
What I recall from the discussions was her concern and the discussions that she initiated across government with fellow health and social care directors and the regular dialogue which she was having even at that time with ministers, particularly the Cabinet Secretary, in relation to the degree of threat. But what was said in those conversations, I'm afraid I don't know.
Are you aware of any information or advice being communicated around this period about the possibility of asymptomatic transmission?
There's a great deal of uncertainty about asymptomatic infection and asymptomatic transmission, two separate things in which need to be taken as two very separate entities. Certainly, by the stage that we were getting towards the end of January, we recognised that it was possible that there was asymptomatic infection. What was very unclear at that stage was whether that asymptomatic infection could actually lead to asymptomatic transmission. And even 6 months later, in July, we still had opinion from the WHO where they were still stating at that point that further research was needed to establish whether there was asymptomatic transmission or not. But asymptomatic infection certainly was considered a possibility at that stage.
Were you aware of any advice being tendered to any ministers around this time by Dr. Calderwood or others about the possibility of asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic transmission?
I am not aware of any discussion in relation to that at all. I wasn't privy to that.
These are potentially very significant revelations being made by Professor Woolhouse. Is that not correct?
These are concerns which have been raised by Professor Woolhouse, which have been raised in a variety of different areas. Professor Woolhouse had taken the time to express his concerns directly to the CMO, but I am aware that very similar concerns were beginning to be spoken about amongst other epidemiologists at that point in time. In fact, were being reported through some of the discussion, even in the early stages of SAGE and NERVTAG, that this virus had the potential to be an incredibly significant development.
Given that significance, if advice had been tendered by the Chief Medical Officer at that time, Dr. Calderwood or others, would that not have been done in writing?
I think you're asking me to speculate on something which I can't answer.
But you're aware of the systems which existed for providing advice to ministers at that time?
I'm aware that sometimes that advice was given directly in conversation, and sometimes that advice was given in written form.
So over this period, it's at least possible that advice could have been tendered by Dr. Calderwood to the First Minister or the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport orally about the matters contained within this email?
It is feasible that could have happened, but as I say, you're asking me to speculate on something which I was not directly involved in, and I'm afraid I can't give you an accurate answer to that.
In the email, Professor Woolhouse points out, again on the second page, just below the passage we looked at before, he says such an epidemic would be difficult to track. As in 2009 to 2010, what would be needed is an integrated surveillance system set up that combines clinical surveillance, genomic surveillance and serological surveillance, the latter requiring an appropriate test. We, and I am sure many others, are working on this already. This should be unexceptionable. My reason for writing now is to emphasise that based on experience of 2009 to 10, that system needs to be put in place in advance of the arrival of the virus, so the sooner the better. If we wait until after the virus has arrived, then we will miss information of public health value, and our efforts to prevent control the epidemic will be compromised. So the general message that Professor Woolhouse at least is trying to convey is that his experience of dealing with epidemics, pandemics of this nature, is that one needs to act decisively and quickly, otherwise it will be too late.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Professor Woolhouse says there is straight out of the health protection playbook. It's surveillance being particularly important part of identifying the possibility of cases. And to do that, you can either try to identify them through clinical means, which is a syndrome of symptoms which are so specific and sensitive to that illness that they're easily to pick up clinically, or a testing infrastructure which allows the disease to be identified by laboratory means. In this case, because the symptoms were relatively non-specific, it relies largely on particularly at this time of the year when there's so many respiratory viruses circulating, it relies on the development of the identification of material to be able to develop a test which can then be used and deployed at scale to be able to identify the virus.
When did a test become available to Scotland?
I don't recall the first available date, but the first instances of us being able to test were led by our NHS laboratories, with 2 regional laboratories based in Glasgow and Edinburgh, being able to offer approximately 300 or so tests a day between them in order that we try to identify those.
I think you're referring there to facilities that were opened up in March in order to provide tests. But what I was wanting to know is, obviously one has to go through a process of genomic sequencing, which leads to a test. That test needs to be put together and then it gets scaled up. When was the test first available? Do you remember?
I don't recall the exact date when when the test was first available. I recall in the very early stages when the first potential cases were identified. Testing at that time was so limited that samples had to be transported through special procedures to reference laboratories, public health laboratories. I think there was perhaps only one in the United Kingdom who was able to operate the test at that time.
Sorry, can I just ask a question? Can I just go back to the email when Professor Woolhouse intervened? He raised the possibility of a very serious threat to Scotland. And by the sounds of it, this resonated with both you and your predecessor as CMO, because you'd heard similar concerns elsewhere. What I don't understand at the moment, Professor, and I'm not sure if you're the one to answer or whether it should be your predecessor, but why didn't the CMO talk to you, her deputy, about this potentially serious threat to the country?
She did, my lady.
She
spoke to me on a regular basis about it, and we discussed Professor Woolhouse's advice, and we discussed both his advice in the context of advice that she was already receiving from other people and from other committees at that point in time as well. So it shouldn't be misunderstood that this was happening in a vacuum at all. This was happening in a way where information was being developed from a variety of different sources. What I am unable to say
is what she then said
is the timing and the exact nature of what she said to others.
So,
sorry, misunderstood.
Thank you, lady. So the position is that you were party to discussions, so you know about the discussions and you've outlined some of the content of those, but you weren't privy to the actions which Dr. Calderwood might have taken as a result of those discussions and these concerns. I think you mentioned that in your evidence earlier, that was broadly your position.
I would love to be able to expand on the detail of that, but I think those questions are best directed to Dr. Calderwood.
And is it the case that the types of surveillance systems which Professor Woolhouse was urging ought to be set up as soon as possible to try to get ahead of the virus started to be set up from this point, or not?
The type of surveillance systems that Professor Woolhouse refers to, as I say, they can be done in 2 ways. They can be done by symptom surveillance, syndrome surveillance. We still have the mechanisms to be able to do that. At that point in time, though, it was at a time of the year with high circulating levels of respiratory virus. So symptom surveillance would have added relatively little information in terms of the specificity of the threat that was presented.
But that's not, I think, what Professor Woolhouse is suggesting.
The second mechanism by which you could have done that would have been to set up a kind of laboratory surveillance mechanism. Now that relies on the development of tests, which are then scaled to a sufficient level that you're able to use and deploy that testing in that way. And unfortunately, that takes time.
But there are even what I think is being urged here. Professor Woolhouse recognises that work is being done on a test. But yes, what he seems to be suggesting is that the systems which would go around the test once it becomes available could be put into place such that when a test does become available, those systems are ready to start the scaling up process that you've talked about. Was action taken at this time to put those systems in place? So
there were recognised surveillance mechanisms across the UK, in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, whereby that type of surveillance was already used through GP practices, what we call sentinel surveillance. And once a test was available in sufficient numbers to be able to do that, people who presented with symptoms which may have been suggestive of the disease could have been tested for it in order to identify them. The deployment of that test into that environment is probably a simpler process than the development of the test to get to sufficient scale that you've got sufficient capacity in the testing in the laboratories to be able to test in that manner. And that takes that's probably the rate limiting step in terms of the approach here.
It's been suggested by reference to a notebook provided by a civil servant called Mr. Grieve, whom you all know, that around this period, although he was attending various meetings, I think some of the ones perhaps you were attending as well, of committees, that there was a general lack of awareness within the Directorate of Health and Social Care, and indeed more widely within Scottish Government, as to the urgency of the threat. What would you accept that was indeed the position, and would you accept that is in stark contrast to what is being urged by Professor Woolhouse?
I am surprised to hear that, because certainly the conversations that I was party to during that time, particularly in late January and early February, was that this was a very urgent threat which had been identified, and which people really needed to turn their attention to. And I think the evidence of what I saw at that point in time was that certainly health and social care directors were very focused upon this. I can't comment on other parts of government as to how significantly they took the threat, but my recollection and observation from that time was that health and social care directors were incredibly worried about the potential that this threat had. And let me assure you that Dr. Calderwood left people in no doubt that was the case. And the conversations that I was party to with fellow directors, it was very clear that she saw this as something which needed to be prioritised.
But you can speak directly, I think, to conversations, to focus, you've mentioned, to worry, but not to action.
Well, the implication behind my remarks there is that action would then be taken in terms of getting organised and preparing. And at that stage...
what action was taken to prepare? Action, not worry, conversation or focus.
So one of the earliest aspects of this that I remember was ensuring that we had briefing mechanisms to make sure that situational awareness of the degree of threat was understood by aspects of the health service, that within proper links were established between departments in Scotland and the rest of the UK to make sure that information was being shared between them, that Scotland was able to be part of any moves to kind of deploy testing as it became available at that stage. As I say, first of all through the NHS laboratory system, then gradually, as it was recognised just the degree of capacity that would be required, how other laboratory systems could come in and assist the NHS in that testing as well. So a whole series of things which began to take place in order to try to prepare health and social care for what was likely to come ahead. And in the meantime, to try to identify when there were potential cases in Scotland, so that the right health protection measures could be taken round about them.
It would have been predictable at this stage that if something of the nature of the threat which Professor Woolhouse was setting out were to become reality, there would be a number of logistical things that would be necessary to put in place to try to protect not only potential victims, but also the healthcare staff that would be required in hospitals and in social care settings against the virus, so that they could adequately deliver care to those who are sick. What steps were taken over this period to try to secure greater supplies of personal protective equipment for those people?
I don't recall specifically how that was approached. I wasn't directly involved in much of that stuff, although there were points in time when I was asked to communicate with the system, I think probably towards late February, early March, about the use of some of the equipment. But that was overseen by a particular unit of health and social care called Health Resilience, and I'm afraid I wasn't directly involved in their work there.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier some difficulties which you had experienced with regard to getting access to information which you were, I think, primarily and understandably deriving from SAGE and NerveTag at that stage. Was the type of information that you were trying to get the type of information that Professor Woolhouse was giving you on a plate?
No.
Why?
No.
What was the information you were having difficulty in getting?
The type of information which I was trying to glean more information about was the timing of interventions in particular, to try to understand from SAGE and the scientists who are engaged there their best advice as to when particular approaches should be implemented in order to have their effect. And it seemed, particularly through the conversations in the early part of March, that it was at that stage less clear as to when some of those interventions should be brought into play.
Okay, let's explore that a little more. So are we talking here about what one might call non-pharmaceutical intervention?
So we're talking about the NPIs here. And,
yes, we've been through an explanation of what that is and what that various forms that might take. So you mentioned that you had been seeking advice about the NPIs and when they might be used profitably in early March. Had you sought information about that before that point?
In terms of the NPIs before that point, there was still much discussion about how NPIs should be used and whether non-pharmaceutical interventions could be used in isolation or whether they needed to be used in, if you like, baskets or bundles of different approaches together. So much of the discussion through SAGE, particularly through the modelling groups, with much of it coming from SPI-M, was actually how would you achieve the desired effect once you began to understand the transmission rate, particularly of the virus, and the R values that were associated with it, how you would begin to slow that down to the extent that the NPIs could actually have a desired effect, and whether that was using one or two NPIs in isolation, or whether in fact it needed a much broader approach to try to reduce the scale of infection at that point in time. There then became the question as to when was the best point in time to try to deploy those NPIs, and a great deal of discussion through that group as to what the likely impacts of deploying those NPIs, either in isolation or collectively, would have, both in halting the virus at that stage, but also potentially simply saving up more impact and trouble with a bigger wave once those were released at that later stage. There was still some uncertainty through the modelling as to what the impacts would be.
And I think, if I heard your evidence correctly, that you mentioned some difficulty in ascertaining information about the best timing in early March. Could you expand on that a little? What was the difficulty that you experienced?
So what we heard at that stage was a lot of discussion, which was about at what point and what would be the triggers for the deployment of societal measures which would be deeply unpleasant for society to experience, and which we would need the significant support of the population in order for them to be effective and to be able to sustain those for a period long enough that they would continue to have their effect. You mentioned earlier the impact, the role of behavioural science at that stage, and behavioural science was an important feature of the discussions at that point in time, when many papers were fed in from SPI-B as to what we might expect in terms of a response from the population to a variety of different approaches. But what I wasn't clear on at that stage yet, and what I didn't see from SAGE was formal advice as to really what the trigger might be for deploying those either singular or multiple interventions, and how we should watch for that. Eventually it settled, as you know from papers which you'll have seen, and there was a variety of triggers which were suggested. Most of the data that we were using at that point, of course, was unfortunately of lagged data. It was health outcome data such as either hospital admission, ICU admission, or even the possibility of the number of deaths that we were likely to see. But that lagged data was one of the things which was suggested and proposed as a trigger event for the institution of those type of measures.
What was your understanding of the role of behavioural fatigue in the advice and discussion that was taking place around that period?
So behavioural fatigue was something which was acknowledged. I remember discussions at SAGE at the possibility that the deployment of particularly severe restrictions on everyday life might lead in some parts of the population to behaviours and fatigue in terms of compliance with those measures, which could actually cause a wave to develop, which would be at that stage fairly significant in terms of the impact on the population.
So was it the case that you were under the impression that advice had been received from experts, including from SPI-B, relating to behavioural fatigue, and that it should play a role in determining when and if a lockdown should be imposed?
I would characterise advice on behavioural fatigue as one of many aspects which were considered in the round in terms of the timing for the deployment.
But did you understand that SPI-B had given such advice?
I understood that SPI-B had raised concerns that behavioural fatigue may be a consideration in terms of the approach. What at that stage was unclear was whether fear of the impact of the virus and the impact of that in the population, the impact of that fear in the population would outweigh the fatigue that they might experience.
I think you also mentioned a moment ago that there was some consideration around this time that the possibility of a bigger wave of the virus was playing some part in the consideration about the timing of the imposition of restrictions or ultimately a lockdown. What was your understanding of the position in that regard? How important was that a factor?
I recall discussions through SAGE where what I heard recounted were concerns through some of the models which had been developed that actually by reducing the initial impact and mitigating that, if measures were not sustained for a long enough time, then the release of those measures, either through non-compliance or because of the harm it was causing to other parts of socio-economic infrastructure within the country, would release an even bigger wave of infection amongst a population that was still immune naive to a virus which was likely to circulate very quickly. A lot of the initial discussion centred upon how long would it be necessary for those measures to stay in place, and would it be necessary to have some degree of breaking, if you like, from spread on a periodic basis until either sufficient therapeutics were available to intervene or a vaccine was available to try to give the population protection.
Evidence emerged of growing infection in Italy in late February, I think. You recall that?
I do, yes.
Scotland's international rugby team played rugby in Rome on the 22nd of February, and the international women's team had been due to play in Legnano, just outside Milan, in the Lombardy region on the 23rd. That match having been cancelled due to local concerns about COVID. Do you recall the Chief Medical Officer or anyone in the department of which you were part being asked to give any advice about the advisability of that match continuing, given concerns about infection rates in that very part of Italy?
I guess that's all I can speak for is that I wasn't approached for advice myself. That's all. I wasn't involved.
If such
in
advice had been provided, would it have been provided in writing?
I would... in a situation like that, there may have been verbal advice given, there may have been written advice given, but I can only speak from my own experience in relation to that rugby match, and that I wasn't asked to provide advice in relation to it.
Would it have been the sort of thing on which advice would have been useful, given the fact that you were accessing information via SAGE and NerveTag about these emerging international cases? Would it have been useful for that to have been communicated, whether it was or not, in decision-making about whether that match should have been allowed to go ahead?
So my own view is that the whole question of international travel at that point in time is something which I think would have been very important to have very risk-averse position in relation to at that stage.
A further international rugby match took place in Scotland, between Scotland and France on the 8th of March. France, as I understand it, was the first country in Europe to have a death from coronavirus. and on the day of the match, France reduced the number of people allowed at mass gatherings to 1,000, and I understand around 67,000 people attended the match at Murrayfield on the 8th of March. Again, are you aware of any advice having been tendered to Scottish Government by the Chief Medical Officer or your Directorate about the advisability of that match being allowed to proceed on Scottish soil?
Again, I can only speak from my perspective, and I was neither approached nor did I give advice in relation to that rugby match.
And again, would one have expected that advice, if given, to have been provided in writing?
Again, I think I have to say to you that that advice may have been given in writing, but may also have been given verbally. I'm afraid I don't know whether that was sought or given.
Thank you. Could I ask to have INQ 000371227 put up on the screen, please? I'm looking at page 77. Excuse me, just one second. Sorry, I'm looking at the, as it appears, the top left corner where it says CMO call.
Mm-hmm.
Could just focus in on that. No, the top left-hand corner, CMO call. We think that this entry comes from the 16th of March 2020. This is from your handwritten notebook, Professor. We think it comes from the 16th of March, where it says, WHO general view that WHO being unhelpful, test being a particular example of misrepresentation. Is that, could you explain what it is that you felt had been a misrepresentation of the test message?
So testing was an incredibly important aspect of the response, and testing had to be ramped up really as quickly as we possibly could, both in terms of the infrastructure to be able to conduct testing, but also during that period while the capacity for testing was available, was to use it in a prioritised way. And it was the view of the CMOs that testing at that stage was most important in identifying people for clinical purposes, to know whether they had COVID or not, to differentiate it from other forms of illness which may need treatment, but also then to isolate them in a way that tried to reduce that transmission to other people as well. And testing should be prioritised in that sense, in order, whilst the capacity to test was increasing. And WHO certainly viewed testing as being very important, but perhaps in the messaging around about testing, they were not perhaps as nuanced in their messaging in terms of how it should be used.
Right. So that was what you consider to be a misrepresentation.
Yeah. Test. There was a strong clinical view, not just held by the CMOs, but held across the profession, that testing was incredibly important so that when faced with a patient who had the potential to have COVID in front of them, first and foremost, we had the ability to be able to determine whether it was COVID or whether it was another treatable disease. And then, of course, if it was COVID, that takes you down a whole pathway of treatment, which necessitates a different, wholly different approach, both in terms of isolation, contact tracing, etc.
What was unhelpful about the WHO's message? That although it set out a clear priority that testing was necessary to try to combat this disease, that Scotland was simply not practically ready to undertake that testing? Was that what was unhelpful about this message?
One of the things that I think was misrepresented here by WHO in those early stages was actually the difficulties in trying to increase the capacity sufficiently quickly to develop a testing at scale.
So they were saying you should test, and Scotland said we couldn't.
I think that is perhaps a characterisation which is unfair. I think Scotland recognised the need for testing, and great efforts were made by the teams involved to try to increase the capacity around testing as quickly as possible. That involved using not only the NHS laboratory infrastructure, but also in linking with other public health laboratory infrastructure, university infrastructure, to try to kind of develop sufficient number of tests across the country, using all means possible. You'll recall that at this particular stage there were all sorts of difficulties with even getting the testing reagents from around the world and procuring testing reagents that were necessary. But what I witnessed was incredible efforts from the teams involved in testing to try to make sure that Scotland and the UK were positioned as importantly as possible. I don't think anyone ever underestimated the importance of testing. But it certainly wasn't easy for these teams in developing it at that time. And I think one of the major lessons, which certainly I would want to see carried through following this, and I'm very glad has been captured within the report of the Standing Committee on Pandemic Preparedness, is to make sure that we've got an infrastructure which is sufficiently agile enough, particularly around about testing, and a public health referenced laboratory testing infrastructure would, for me, be ideal to be able to turn its attention to emerging threats as they were identified in a way which was different from our experience in February and March of 2020.
So for future pandemic preparedness, you think it's extremely important that the infrastructure is maintained to enable all of the testing that's required to be put into action as quickly as possible?
That's one of the major pieces of learning that I would certainly want to single out from this, is that there are particular parts of infrastructure which were put in place that whilst we could never maintain at the levels that existed during the height of the pandemic, certainly need to be there in a way where we can pivot in an agile way as possible.
So one might say the core of that existing infrastructure needs to be maintained for future pandemics.
And some of that might be laboratory space, and some of that might be laboratory expertise and resource in individuals. But I do think that it's really important that as a country we have a laboratory system which is preserved and invested in over the coming years. But that's one of the things I would like to see for the
I have one other question about testing, but before we go off what's on the screen, just at the same point there, you make a note relating, I think it says SAGE masks likely to recommend. Was it your understanding at that stage that SAGE was likely to recommend something to do with face masks? Is that what that's referring to?
Yeah, at this stage it was very, very unclear just exactly how advice was going to be developed around about masks and coverings, face coverings, noting that there's a distinction between the two. And eventually the recommendation from SAGE was that it was face coverings rather than face masks. But I think those are two separate items which you see on screen there, the two dashes.
I see. So they were discussing masks, but they were likely to recommend something else. Does that mean?
Well, with the passage of time, I can't speak with accuracy as to exactly what that annotated comment means. But I do remember there being discussion in SAGE in relation to and debate as to whether face masks or face coverings were likely to be the preferred option.
Right. Just on testing again, could I take you please to, we mentioned Professor Crossman earlier, to his statement, which is INQ 000273976. I'm looking at paragraph 10. Professor Crossman played a significant role in the testing side of things. Is that correct?
He did.
Yes, thank you. He says there, from January until around the middle of March 2020, I was not involved in pandemic management. I could see that individuals with government advisory function in the other nations were having some role in pandemic response, and I was aware that some strategies were emerging, for example, in testing for, I think it's meant to be SARS-CoV-2 infection. I was not formally asked to expand my role, but it was the absence of a SARS-CoV-2 testing strategy in Scotland, when there was one in England and Wales, that caused me to contact Catherine Calderwood, then CMO, and bring this to her attention, as I was concerned that without the ability to test for the causative agent, the pandemic would be unmanageable. At that stage, I offered my services to the CMO to help with the response. The CMO responded that it would be helpful to have a strategy, but if I was going to do this, it needed to be done quickly. I responded and delivered the first strategy with a civil servant, Mary Stewart, by the 28th of March, and this seemed to establish me as a useful advisor to the Scottish Government's response. Could it be taken from that, do you think, that the Scottish Government had no strategy for testing until Professor Crossman helpfully offered his services?
I think that could be one reading of what Professor Crossman has said in his statement.
If that were the case, would that be a fair reflection of the reality?
I think at that stage, the Scottish approach to testing was very much mirroring those which were happening in the other UK nations in terms of the prioritisation of testing. However, I think what Professor Crossman and his colleagues did very successfully was to take what was a rather informal approach and to formalise that within a written strategy, so that people could be very clear as to how testing was going to be developed and prioritised for different purposes.
I think he describes it as the absence of a testing strategy. That doesn't tend to suggest that there was one at all.
I think you would have to ask Professor Crossman in greater detail, but what I would take from that is that there wasn't a written strategy.
Thank you.
But except he contrasts it with the position in England and Wales where there was one. Mm-hmm. And you said that Scotland was there mirroring the rest of the UK.
That was my recollection of it, was the discussion that certainly happened in clinical circles at those point in time, was that Scotland was taking a similar approach to other countries in the UK, but there was no written strategy that backed that up.
Well, we'll check with Professor Crossman.
Thank you. Moving on to a slightly different area, but in the same time period, we've heard some evidence already from Dr. McMenamin and Professor Finn about the well-known Nike conference. I only want to focus with you on one aspect of that. Could we go to INQ 000225995, please? This is an exchange concerning this very thing. It mentions you, I think, having some involvement. Do you recall discussion around this early period to do with the what should be said about concerns that were arising around the Nike conference at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I recall coming into this at a kind of latter stage. I think that by this point in time, the first cases had already been identified. An incident management team was up and running in relation to it, and my recollection is that the CMO fed in to that process. I came into it, as I say, probably at a later stage when it was beginning to be a little bit of concern as to what was being said.
Mm-hmm. I think broadly what this is showing is this is the Chief of Staff to the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, looking for some advice about what should be said around it, because I think you've identified by this point, which is towards the beginning of March, there had been some efforts in connection with this event to try to, we heard from Dr. McMenamin, to try to trace cases and to try to work out what was going on. Yeah. I think he described those as local efforts to try to deal with the situation. There was, I think, fair to say, a question mark as to whether this should be publicised in particular. And if we could go back to page 1, please, I think we see Dr. Calderwood's response. Relating to this, she suggests towards the bottom that her strong advice would be not to say anything here specifically, and that naming the conference risks breaching patient confidentiality, as a delegate list will be available. So it seems that the Chief of Staff, on behalf of the First Minister, has been seeking some guidance, and that there is a medical aspect to this in Dr. Calderwood's view, which connects to patient confidentiality, and that her view is that as a result of that, this shouldn't be released publicly, what has happened and what is going on to try and control it. What was the issue about patient confidentiality, in the sense that could information not have been released with any patient details completely anonymised in order to keep the public informed about this potential significant threat?
There was a great deal of concern in those early stages about the welfare for people who'd been identified as having COVID-19, and a process, well recognised process in outbreak management, which we call deductive disclosure, which is about managing the tension that exists between not giving information which could lead to the deductive disclosure or identification of a person associated with that outbreak, and fulfilling legitimate public interest in terms of public messaging and transparency about any outbreak as well. And that is the tension that exists not just in relation to the response which we saw during COVID times, but it exists with every public health protection response which exists, and a real fear amongst clinicians that inadvertently, by issuing particular types of advice, actually you remove a patient's right to confidentiality and the illness which they might be experiencing. So Dr. Calderwood's concerns here are something which we see and encounter regularly when managing outbreaks across the country. And different clinicians will have different levels of risk tolerance in order to that. And I know that Dr. Calderwood in particular was very against any circumstances whereby she may be responsible for the release of confidential patient information, and a particularly high level of a high risk threshold in relation to that. I think when you speak to other clinicians, they might have different levels of risk tolerance in relation to that. My own view in this case was that, and it's probably recorded in some of the email systems, I suspect, is that whilst it was really important to maintain patient confidentiality at all times, that there was in this case, there was an interest, a legitimate public interest, that meant that some information, some form of information,
that's precisely what I was getting at.
Could be released, but it had to be very, very carefully thought through, the implications of that. Yes. So as not, particularly when there's such small numbers at this stage, early stage of this outbreak being identified. Another word on the Nike conference, if I can, because I think it's really important that when we're speaking about the Nike conference, we commend and recognise the efforts of the health protection teams that were involved in dealing with this conference, because their actions at that point in time probably, well, we now know that from the evidence from the genomic sampling,
we went through that, although your tribute is handled
this outbreak so thoroughly that actually we were able to there was no further examples of that lineage died out in Scotland as a consequence.
There were, I think, though, in the same report, between 290 and 310 other incursions of COVID into Scotland over this period.
I think this is really important to understand, actually, when you look at the way COVID was introduced to Scotland, and this is not just in the period probably February and March of 2020, but also later on that summer when international travel began to open up. What we saw the evidence for, particularly through this relatively new discipline of genomic sampling, which was a wonderful innovation used extensively during the early part of this response to understand transmission dynamics of the virus. But what we saw was that, as you say, there were several hundred incursions of the virus of different types across Scotland at that point in time. So rather than, if you like, a ground zero, which occurred in Scotland, actually that multiple seeding through international travel that there was at that event made it very difficult to control the virus in those early stages.
Dr. McMenamin, when we discussed this on Friday, was at pains to, I had suggested to him that perhaps a number of these strains had come from Spain, and he was at pains to say that it came from a number of the major European countries, including Italy and France. And of course, the Scotland rugby teams, international rugby teams, played rugby in Italy in late February, didn't they? Or one of them did.
And many people from Scotland visited for skiing in those kind of areas as well. And you know, international tourism being as it is just now, there will always be a risk that as infection of one sort or another begins to show itself globally, is that there will be further and further incursions as a consequence of that.
And equally, a number of people from France came to Scotland to watch Scotland play France on the 8th of March as well.
And as you say, there were tourists come to Scotland, and Scottish people visit other countries for a number of different reasons.
But those events were predictable and might have been able to have been controlled.
I think that those are events that, with the benefit of hindsight, you're right, they could have had an impact, but the degree to which they've had an impact is, at this stage, I'm afraid.
Well, whether it's necessary to rely on hindsight will be a matter for her ladyship in due course. But as regards this very matter, I wonder if I could take you to your witness statement 000273978 to page 71, paragraph 280, where you give us some useful information about an important event. You're talking here about the first person to test positive for COVID in Scotland, and you say the first person to test positive for COVID in Scotland was on the 1st of March 2020. This person was a returning traveller. Subsequently, the first person to test positive through evidence of community transmission, no exposure to known contact or returning traveller, was the 11th of March 2020. This was significant because it implied that COVID-19 was already spreading within communities, and so the geographic element of the case definition was removed. It also heralded the move to the delay phase of the response. And furthermore, so this gives some background. I understand that on the 13th of March, an announcement was made by your we can take that down, thank you. Your announcement was made by your predecessor about the first death in Scotland from COVID. And what was said at that time by Dr. Calderwood was, "I am saddened to report that a patient in Scotland who has tested positive for coronavirus has died in hospital. I offer my deepest sympathy to their friends and family at this difficult time. The patient who was being treated by Lothian Health Board was an older person who had underlying health conditions. No further information will be available to protect patient confidentiality." It was subsequently suggested in the press that the person who had died was in fact a Frenchman who had attended the Scotland rugby game. That does not feature in the analysis given by Dr. Calderwood. Is it your understanding that that is in fact correct? And why did that not appear in Dr. Calderwood's announcement?
I have to say to you, I have no knowledge of that whatsoever.
I'd like to ask you some questions, please, about the circumstances in which you came to take on the post initially of interim CMO and subsequently CMO in December. Could I just ask you, before we get into the detail of that, why was it that you were appointed interim CMO for such a lengthy period and then took over as the full CMO, if you like, and did that have any practical significance at all?
So the reason I was interim CMO for, that must have been approximately 6 months or so, was partly because I was managing a pandemic at that point in time, and the appointments process to an office such as the CMO is a fairly rigorous one, and one which is overseen by civil service commissioners. So it's a competitive process with different stages. And I think in order to make sure that usually the appointment of a CMO is a process which takes several months from the point of identification of potential candidates through advertisement, through to assessment centres which people participate in, and then interview. And as I say, subsequently it was decided that sufficient stabilisation had occurred within the system by late 2020, that process could be begun, and still at that point it probably took 3 to 4 months from advertisement through to appointment. But
to all intents and purposes, am I correct in thinking you performed the role of the CMO, whether you were interim or not?
So the role of, I guess it's important to point out at this stage that I wasn't the first interim CMO that Scotland has had. There have been instances before from the handing of one CMO to the next whether an interim has been appointed. In fact, before Dr. Calderwood took office.
What I'm trying to get at, Professor Smith, is I just want to know whether from the 5th of April 2020, irrespective of the title and the various procedures, which understandably to be followed, you were the principal medical advisor to the Scottish Government on matters relating to COVID?
So it was exactly the same.
Thank you. You were asked in your statement whether the resignation of Dr Calderwood had had an effect on Scotland's response. You've already told us that she had been a pivotal figure, understandably, in the response up till that point. You say in your statement that the resignation of Dr Calderwood did not affect Scotland's pandemic response and that the CMOD continued to provide advice to policy colleagues in the Scottish Cabinet. In light of what you've already told us about the significance of her response, are you seriously suggesting that this had little or no impact?
The biggest impact it had was on the workload for the rest of the directorate at that point in time. We suddenly found ourselves with an important trusted colleague who was no longer available there, who had developed relationships with ministers, and if there was any detrimental aspect of it at that point in time was that during that immediate period, it was about building relationships with those ministers in order that I could provide them with advice that they were seeking from me. Over the latter course of March, my time with ministers began to increase a little bit. I did conversations with the former First Minister on several occasions. I knew the Cabinet Secretary for Health well at that stage as well. And so by that point in time, I was able to slip into the role without too much detriment. You'll recall that in that period, the course was already set in terms of the approach, and it was very much about being able to kind of give advice, develop advice as new evidence was coming in at that point in time.
Is it correct to say that Dr Calderwood had a particularly close relationship, as you said, with the former First Minister, Ms Sturgeon, and the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, Ms Freeman?
I think my observation would be that she had a good relationship with the former First Minister and with the Cabinet Secretary, and indeed with other ministers that she had contact with as well. She was an important figure, and she was trusted, I think, by them. And
you presumably required to build a relationship, as you've described, with those two important figures in the pandemic response?
I believe that I had a trusted relationship and benefited from a lot of contact with the Cabinet Secretary before that point in time. But I didn't have quite the level of contact or relationship that Dr Calderwood had with the former First Minister.
I think you suggested a moment ago that the course for the COVID response had already been set by that point. Did that mean that you inherited a plan that had been devised by someone else?
At that point in time, we were approximately, I would have thought, 2 weeks into what later became known as lockdown. And much of the discussion was about what impact was that lockdown having, and how was it stabilising the drastic situation that we saw across the country. And we began to turn our attention at that stage to, if it was beginning to stabilise, then for how long did those drastic measures that we all experienced have to stay in place for, and how would we begin to kind of gradually over time reduce that in as safe a way as possible.
At the very moment of her resignation, a few days before, on the 1st of April, Scotland's confirmed cases of Covid-19 had passed 2,000, with 76 deaths in hospital that day. The Scottish Government had just announced its ambition to deliver 3,500 tests by the end of the month. Construction had just started on the SEC in Glasgow to become the NHS Louisa Jordan, and the day after her resignation, the Coronavirus Scotland Act was introduced, gaining royal assent on the 31st of March. In light of these very, very important developments with regard to the strategy, it's true to say, isn't it, that this was the worst moment that one could possibly find for Dr Calderwood to depart the scene?
In the management of a pandemic, particularly in the early management of a pandemic, I don't think there's any good time to lose an advisor, particularly an advisor who has built that level of trust and relationships across the system. So I don't think that there is any good time at all.
Is it correct to say that there were attempts made within the Scottish Government to keep Dr Calderwood in her role despite the events which led to her resignation?
I wouldn't be party to that. I wouldn't know.
Do you know when it was that the Scottish Government became aware of the matters which led to her resignation compared to when it was that she eventually resigned?
I can only tell you when I became aware, and I became aware on the Saturday evening, which I think would be April the 4th, perhaps.
I think that's right. I checked this earlier. I think April the 5th, the day of her resignation, she resigned late in the evening. That was a Sunday. So I think you're absolutely right.
So I think it would be late afternoon, early evening on Saturday the 4th that I became.
The reason I ask is that there are, I won't go to the detail, but you will no doubt remember that obviously this was a difficult time for you and the rest of your team to have to take over responsibility. And there's some mention in some messages of the focus on Dr. Calderwood being slightly difficult for the team who was trying to keep the show on the road, understandably. And that there's a suggestion in those messages that you refer to the team who have been giving advice over the course of the week. It tends to suggest, therefore, that perhaps the focus on having to deal with Dr. Calderwood in a more pastoral sense, which is also suggested, had been going on for some time before her resignation through the course of that week, which then culminated on Sunday the 5th.
No, that's an incorrect interpretation of that.
Okay, thank you. But your first intimation of it was on the Saturday?
Yeah.
Thank you. I've asked you some questions already about your role on the Scottish Government COVID Advisory Group. One matter which has come up in our analysis of the group's minutes is that you did not attend the third meeting, which took place on the 2nd of April 2020, the fourth meeting on the 6th of April 2020, the fifth meeting on the 9th of April 2020, the sixth meeting on the 13th of April 2020, nor the 7th on the 16th of April, nor the 8th on the 20th of April. You mentioned a moment ago the importance of creating relationships with your ministerial and indeed other civil service colleagues. Why was it that you failed to attend these meetings?
Because I would have had duties or priorities that sat elsewhere at that point in time. And I already knew many of the personalities who were involved in that group. I'd established relationships with them. The chair in particular I had a very trusted relationship with, and we were able to use that trusted relationship to provide advice back and forward, and for me to be able to get a full recount of the meeting from. And whenever I wasn't able to attend the meeting itself, I had one of my deputies delegating for me at that meeting. But really the relationships were already largely established with members of that group.
Although, no doubt, these very eminent professionals were very well known to you. In this specific context, the context of a new group being set up to provide advice through you to ministers, which had been set up originally under the auspices of your predecessor, was it not very significant, was it not very important for you to attend these initial meetings to try to set up the way in which the group was going to function and to establish those relationships in that particular context?
That type of information was conveyed through the conversations that I had with the chair at that point in time. Unfortunately, it just wasn't possible for me to be everywhere at once, and there were many calls on my time at that point in time, which just I couldn't be in two places at the one time.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you some questions. We've covered this area with a number of other witnesses, including Dr. McMenamin and Professor Finn. I'd like to ask you some questions about the position with regard to the Chief Medical Officer's office and the minimisation of infections within care homes. We've looked in some detail, and I won't take you to all the detail, Professor, with other witnesses, including Dr. McMenamin particularly, at the report that was done by PHS in this regard, which came out in October 2020, which helpfully sets out the pieces of published guidance that emanated from PHS with regard to the management of infection in care homes. And we've looked at the particulars of that, which I don't intend to take you to. What I would be interested to know is the extent to which the Chief Medical Officer's office, because this was before you became the Chief Medical Officer, was involved in the compilation and publication of the advices, of the guidance that emanated principally from PHS on the 13th of March and then later in the month, the 26th, I think was the other day.
So I don't recall any involvement. There was a separate structure which was set up to provide advice through that, to develop that guidance. I know that Public Health Scotland and some advisors within Scottish Government worked closely together in relation to that guidance, but I didn't have any direct involvement in that.
Right. We've heard evidence, or we have evidence, that there were a number of versions of the guidance created. I think 2 were ultimately issued, but a number of versions existed. It creates an impression of a slightly chaotic picture in terms of the allocation of responsibilities for who is meant to put together and compile this guidance, whether it's a government CMO type of exercise or whether it's PHS or both. Do you have any recollection of that characterisation being an accurate one over that period?
As I say, I wasn't directly involved, so I couldn't even comment as to how many iterations there were.
Thank you. But there were other individuals effectively from within your directorate who were engaged in that process, along with Dr McMenamin and others?
There were other government clinical advisors. Whether they were within the directorate at that stage or not, I cannot recall.
We've heard evidence as regards this care home situation that there is a kind of cultural issue which exists within Scottish Government as regards its healthcare provision. That there is an instinct to look after hospitals and then to look after care homes and last to look after those who are in residential care in their own homes. Is that a cultural issue which you recognise to any extent, and in particular relating to this very significant period?
So I have to say to you that I don't recognise that as being a scenario which I ever saw play out, certainly in my presence. I think that there was, in the conversations that I recall from that period, there was general concern about the potential for the spread of infection in any closed setting. And I would put it as broadly as that. So I would also include in that not just hospitals, care homes, residential homes, but also prisons, places like that, where any closed setting where actually there was a population who may be at greater risk and that the virus could spread within. And we'd already seen some of that play out in other countries, particularly Italy at that time, about the potential for that.
Ms Lamb, who you'll know, who gave evidence earlier, suggested that in this regard, as Dr McMenamin and Professor Finn had suggested, there was a need as regards testing for there to be a degree of prioritisation amongst groups who might be tested. Ms Lamb gave evidence to the effect that prioritisation was a matter on which advice was given by the Chief Medical Officer or the Chief Medical Officer's Directorate. Do you have any knowledge of that advice and the basis upon which it was given as regards who should receive tests by way of priority over other groups?
So the only prioritisation that I recall at that point in time, particularly in those early stages, was that testing where it was available should be particularly prioritised for those with a clinical need, so to determine what illness they had, whether it was COVID or not, whether it was another treatable illness, and how those patients should be managed. Beyond that, as a first priority, I wouldn't be able to comment.
Thank you for that. My lady, if that's a convenient moment, I'd be happy to...
Certainly.
Thank you.
I shall return at 3:15. Mr Dawson.
Thank you, my lady. Could I start by returning to an area we were looking at earlier and ask a question I forgot to ask you? You were giving some evidence about your involvement, albeit limited, in the advice that was provided to Scottish Government over the initial few months before the first lockdown. And you told us, of course, that the principal advisor in that regard was the Chief Medical Officer, Dr Calderwood, and you were not privy to a lot of the discussions. But you certainly discussed matters with her as her deputy. Would that be broadly correct?
Yes.
I was interested to know whether, at that time, your understanding was that the Scottish Government had the legal power to impose restrictions on members of Scottish society, or whether, in having these discussions and providing advice, you were under the impression that that legal power was something they did not have, which would later, of course, come through the Coronavirus Act. What was your understanding of the position?
So what I recall from that time is that there was discussion between policy teams at that point to what extent Scotland had both the powers and the capabilities to support the population should an event like that begin to happen. I probably became more privy towards those conversations during the period of March than earlier than that. But as we were exploring what the possible responses could be from the output of SAGE, it was becoming more and more evident that actually Scotland, although they had the powers to be able to kind of take that course of action, one of the difficulties in doing that was to be able to identify particularly the financial support for people to support them during that period.
The reason I ask is, of course, if one were in the position of Dr. Calder at the time giving advice about what options might exist and you weren't privy to the precise advice that was given, it would be important to know, would it not, what the range of legal options actually were, because you might wish to suggest something which simply couldn't be done, and therefore it would be a waste of time, whereas if the impression was that you did have the legal power to impose restrictions in the nature of a lockdown or something short of a lockdown, that would inform the matters on which advice from a medical perspective might be tendered. Isn't that right?
So within that context, I guess it's understanding what powers were immediately available at that point in time and what powers could be developed through emergency legislation. And my understanding is that those areas were explored. But as I say, not being privy to those conversations directly, I can't give you
Of course, we take your evidence in that regard with that caveat, as I set out at the beginning. To return then to where we were, which was discussing, again, an area you had a certain amount of involvement in, which was care homes, could I take you to INQ 000371227? This, again, is one of your notebooks. Page 45. And I'm looking for... Yeah, it's on the left-hand side there. You make a note. We think from the previous entry that this is dated. You can see on the right-hand side there's an entry of March. This is 2020. The left-hand side, we think this is dated the 23rd of March 2020. So this shows some level of involvement or information that you have in the care homes issue at that time. And you've written CNOD view. If moved to opening care homes to admissions when positive cases, it will need additional staff to care for isolated patients and use associated IPC processes. So should that be CMOD?
no. CNOD.
The Chief Nursing Officer.
So this looks, in this case, it's information that I've jotted down that has been provided by potentially the Chief Nursing Officer or one of her staff in relation to their view. Who the Chief Nursing Officer's Directorate is the lead directorate for infection prevention and control measures, and really was provided significant clinical input into the development of approach to care homes. So,
well, can you tell us what you understand this to mean as being the CNOD view, rather than me suggesting to you what it?
What I read from this short passage, which I've written down here, which says, I suspect has been jotted down from a meeting at some point, is that if admissions to care homes are contemplated when there are already positive cases within that care home, then they need to almost separate streams of staff, additional staff, just to look after the isolated patients and to take care of the infection prevention and control processes. I think these were ideas which were being bandied about around about capacity rather than any kind of definitive position in relation.
So, yes, I understand the context, but this seems to contemplate the possibility that there will be positive cases in care homes. Yes?
I think it was always recognised that there would be the potential for positive cases in care homes. I think that we realised that it was with ingress and egress from care homes, just with staff, with visitors, with other sorts, then that it was always a possibility that someone could take infection into that environment, or it could come from other sources as well.
And are you aware of the particular issue, I think, highlighted as the Chief Nursing Officer Directorate is pointing out that if positive cases did get into care homes, then it would need additional staff in order to care for the isolated patients, because there would need to be a degree of isolation and with various processes, infection control, I think, processes. Was anything done to try to address the fact that additional staff in care homes would be needed, as had been highlighted as far as you're aware over this period?
I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I think that's a question for people who are more closely involved in that work.
Okay, thank you very much. If I could go on to a different area, I'd like to ask you broadly some questions about various parts of the strategy for the Scottish Government's fight against coronavirus and the various different phases that it went through. Could I go to your statement, please, to paragraph 506 at page 126, at 000273,978. Paragraph 506, please, page 126. Thank you. This is a section of your lengthy report in which you're telling us, it's a broad reflection, although in a particular context, about the differences in approach which emerged between in particular, the UK government's response and the Scottish government response. We heard some evidence about specific meetings around about the beginning to middle of May from Mr Thompson the other day, leading to a COBRA meeting which took place on the 10th of May, which he identified as being effectively a point at which you could recognise a significant, he didn't like the word divergence, but divergence in the approaches. And you are comparing and contrasting, I think, here at a general level, the reasons why you think that those differences emerged. And you say, it is my view that the differences in approach between UK nations were in part influenced by clinical and demographic considerations. Scotland has an older population with greater levels of multi-morbidity and therefore greater risk of harm from Covid-19, and in part by national tolerance of risk and harm in each of the 4 harm domains. This national tolerance of risk, in my view, is not as simple as saying Scottish Government's tolerance of risk, as population polling and attitude surveys were used extensively alongside other sources of information to inform that understanding more fully. There is a consistent theme amongst the evidence in written form given to this inquiry about this issue, that Scotland had a different tolerance to risk, and I'd like to explore that with you a little bit. First of all, there seem to be 2 major components of what you're saying here, is that there were clinical and demographic reasons why a different tolerance might be applied, and I'll ask you about that in a moment, but that there was also some additional factor which you describe as there being some different national tolerance of risk, which I think you're suggesting is evidenced by polling and attitude surveys. Can you tell us, please, precisely where it is that this national tolerance of risk and the impression of it, in particular around this time from May onwards, where that emanates from, as it seems to be a rather abstract concept which is hard to grasp hold of?
I agree that the whole concept of risk is sometimes difficult to grasp, and I guess the starting point for this is to understand...
Just to be clear, Professor, it's more the national tolerance element I'm interested in.
But I think that the concept of risk is also difficult to grasp in this context as well. I think perhaps I'd best start with the clinical aspects of this, if I may, and that's to explain why I think this is important, because Scotland does have an older population than other parts of the UK, and we knew even by this stage that it was very clear that older groups of people were at greater risk from the effects of the coronavirus. But not only is it an older population, but it's a sicker population. And it's a sicker population for many reasons, but the development of what we call multimorbidity, that is the people having multiple medical conditions, chronic medical conditions that impact on their health, is more evident in Scotland than in other parts. And not only is it more evident, but it also tends to occur at a slightly earlier age. And a lot of that is influenced by the health inequalities that we see across the nation as well. So again, a strong piece of learning is about one of the ways to make a country more resilient against any pandemic is to improve the general health of the population, but particularly those who experience inequalities.
Is it correct to say, Professor, can I just, we've heard quite a lot of evidence about the health inequalities and some specific characteristics of that, as well as the fact that Scotland has an older population, particularly from our statistical witnesses. You are saying here, I think, that the different approach taken from May onwards was driven in part by the different morbidity levels, the health inequalities. Was it the case that Scotland had greater health inequalities, worse health, and an older population throughout the pandemic?
So we had worse health and greater inequalities leading into the pandemic,
yes,
which was perpetuated through the pandemic.
So
yes. What it does is it places our population at a much greater risk.
Yes, I understand. What I'm trying to establish is whether these factors remained a constant, such that Scotland had these factors taken into account, which were not as great a factor in other nations of the United Kingdom. Is that correct?
So yes, and one of the reasons for spending some time just to explain this is because I think that begins to you begin to explain and understand why the risk thresholds in Scotland was perhaps set slightly higher because of the perceived additional risk to the population because of these increasing burden of increased burden of disease that existed within the population.
Was it your advice to the Scottish Government, based on these considerations, in May 2020, that it ought to ease the lockdown more slowly, thereby diverging from the UK Government's approach, because of this higher level of multimorbidity and the older population? So
my advice, you recall, at that point in time would be taken in the context of the 4 harms, which was already established at that point.
But as far as the harms you covered,
but my advice in terms of the health-related harms was that actually the risk to the Scottish population was greater because of the demographics and the burden of disease that existed within the country.
The Scottish population had these different characteristics at the time of the first lockdown, but no earlier restrictions were imposed. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
The Scottish population had these characteristics in the summer of 2020, when the borders were open to allow tourists to go to Spain and return, eventually causing these older, sicker people considerable harm. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
At the time of the circuit breaker lockdowns in Wales and Northern Ireland and England between September and November 2020, when no Scottish national lockdown occurred, these factors also existed.
These factors existed throughout that time. The Scottish population has continually, as I say, demonstrated that it's been a little bit older than the other parts of the UK and has this heavier burden of disease.
These factors existed when Scotland went into its second lockdown, no earlier than England's second lockdown. Isn't that right?
It is.
And from summer 2021, when infection rates were the highest in the UK due to the Delta wave and no lockdown took place, these considerations were also part of the picture.
It is.
And
what
in late
if I may, what we should recall is that risk is dynamic, and over that period which you're describing, what we saw very importantly was also the introduction of additional therapeutic interventions and, most importantly, a vaccination programme which began to reduce the level of direct risk from the virus as a consequence. So it is not true, whilst the risk, or whilst the burden of disease and the elderliness of the population was a fairly constant during that time, the degree of risk that they faced was altered and influenced by the therapeutics and the vaccine which came into play at that time.
This difference remained in late 2021 into 2022, when the infection rates in Scotland were the highest in the UK, due to Delta and Omicron, and no national lockdown took place. Is that not right?
As I explained, risk is dynamic.
But these factors still existed at that time.
The elderliness of the population and the burden of disease, which by that point was influenced, the risk associated with them was influenced by the protective nature of the vaccines and also the therapeutics that were available.
How were you able to measure the level of protection that was given by the vaccines over those later periods?
So the type of protection which the vaccine offered was monitored through what was, I think, one of the most important developments in terms of data over the course of the pandemic response, what became known as the EVE2 platform, led by the Usher Institute in Edinburgh, but really a collaboration between a number of institutes, including Public Health Scotland and Strathclyde University as well. But really the data which they were able to produce, looking at the degree of risk to the population from a variety of different sources, whether that be new variants or the protection which was offered by the vaccine, became an incredibly important part of the information which was used to kind of associate risk within the country.
What we're trying to do here is to work out why it is that Scotland took the same approach at certain times, but a different approach in May 2020. You've introduced the concept of the vaccines offering a protection in the EVE2 study, again, which we've heard about from other witnesses. But that protection was afforded to people in the other nations of the United Kingdom equally, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
So that was a factor as regards the comparison, which was consistent, although the inconsistent factor remained Scotland's multimorbidity and elderly population. So
again, just to emphasise again, risk is dynamic. Over that point in time, we would see the same level of risk is dynamic in the other countries as well. But if there is an approach to risk within this country, it would be influenced by the confidence that the protections that the population was having from these other sources was going to have the desired effect and could replace some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions which were in play.
Thank you. The second component, you've taken them quite rightly, I think, the other way around with the clinical and demographic considerations first. But I was also interested in trying to explore with you what you mean by what appears to be the other component of the decision-making process, which is the national tolerance of risk and harm, which I think you are suggesting is demonstrable through population polling and attitude surveys. If I may say so, Professor, that seems like a rather unscientific concept. Could you help us with that?
Yeah, what we saw was that the level of fear and anxiety through some of this polling and attitude survey was really quite significant, and fear of the virus in particular was evident through that. We also heard it very clearly and strongly from many public groups as well who were expressing concern. There was, I think it's fair to say, a real anxiety, concern, particularly for those who were identified as the highest risk groups, so the group which at the beginning of the pandemic would have been known as the shielding group, but those at greatest risk. There was a particular anxiety that they would be left behind and that some of their needs would not be particularly catered for. And I heard some very compelling stories from some of those people and groups when either they wrote to me or spoke to me about their experience as well. And so all of that begins to create an impression that actually there was a significant aspect of the Scottish public that was very cautious and fearful in their approach and was perhaps more risk averse than we were seeing in other places. I think that was reflected in attitudes of some of the decision makers as well.
Was that not the case then at the other times, which I've mentioned, when Scotland didn't take greater restrictions? So, for example, you mentioned the shielding category. Was it not the case that people who were shielding were concerned about the virus when cases started to rise in August 2020, at exactly the same time that the shielding restrictions were lifted on the 1st of August by the Scottish Government.
And I think what we saw there was increasing confidence that actually the level of harm which was likely to be experienced by anyone had dropped to a level because of, although case levels were rising at that point, they were still at a very, very low level compared to before.
But in essence, whether people in the public's attitude towards risk was one thing or another is not really the most important thing to weigh in the balance, is it? It's what the science tells you about what the risk is. And of course, members of the public didn't get the SCORE sitrep with all of its information in it. So whether people have a certain attitude, what your job was to give advice as to how they should be protected, whatever their attitude was, isn't that right?
Which I continued to do, but I didn't make decisions, and you have
course.
to call that. And so, whilst the advice that I may have given during that time remained fairly constant, it was always influenced for the decision makers by advice which was coming from other areas of government, and particularly took into account the impact on the other harms.
I see. So in the period where one might say there is a closer alignment after there having been a period of divergence, to use the phrase Mr Thompson doesn't like, over, say, May to August, one sees these phenomena such as shielding being lifted across the United Kingdom on the 1st of August. That's a common thing that happens. And then from then on, the various things that happen tend to suggest that Scotland's restrictions are either less than or equal to the rest of the UK. In that period, is your position that you continued to give advice that one needed to be focused in particular on the first harm, but decision makers made decisions with more regard to the other harms? So
my role was consistent during that time. As we've explored before, my role was to give the best advice that I could in terms of preventing harm 1 and harm 2.
Yes.
And that advice had to be taken and integrated into the advice that was being received from other parts of the government as well, and other advisors within government. And I think what we can see in the decision making there is a changing approach to the relative importance of each one of those harms as time went on. We should remember that whilst the harms relating to COVID changed over time as well because of the influence of vaccines and therapeutics, the harms which people suffered economically also changed over time as well. So whilst some people might be able to cope, albeit with difficulty, with a short period of economic instability and difficulty, the longer that goes on, the greater the impact that has as well. So the whole concept of risk, whether we're talking about health harms, whether we're talking about the society harms, or whether we're talking about the economic harms, none of that is static and constant. That is all dynamic.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier, I think somewhat in passing, the position with regard to borders. I was interested to know, we heard some information again from Mr Thompson helpfully about the way in which borders were controlled. And although he insisted that the distinction was not a blurry one, there was a slight complexity with regard to the way that borders were operated, because borders were a reserved matter for the purposes of immigration and nationality. But as far as the pandemic was concerned, it was a devolved matter. Because the control of borders pertain to a matter of public health, which, of course, as you know, is a devolved matter. When there were significant and frequent changes to the rules about which countries, what the countries were from which people would be allowed to enter Scotland, or vice versa, over the period, in particular, for a period in 2020 and again in 2021, when advice was being tendered in this regard, was advice sought from you about whether you thought countries were too risky or not? Or was advice sought from elsewhere? Because there were divergences in the approach, but our understanding from other evidence we heard last week was that the evidence base as to what the risk was in any given country was the same as between Scotland and the United Kingdom.
So the evidence was produced by the JBC. We've referred to the JBC before, and they produced really helpful evidence packs where they would be examining the information that was available in relation to certain countries and their either the levels of infection, hospitalisation, or the emergence of potential variants within those. and I would be involved in giving advice to ministers with teams from both health policy but also from travel policy in relation to those countries, and participated in ministerial calls across the 4 nations in relation to that as well. And again, I think what you see in terms of the occasional divergence of the approach, and it didn't happen terribly often, but occasionally, there was a divergence in approach between the 4 UK nations, where risk appetite probably influenced how quickly the response was made.
But if the evidence base was the same, what was the reason why these divergences started to occur?
I can only assume that in the decision makers there, and perhaps even in the advice that was given, is that the tolerance for risk was greater in some countries than others. Certainly from my perspective, I was always very, very aware and cognizant of the evidence that had been produced about the multiple incursions that there had been both in the early part of the pandemic, but then again in the late summer of 2020, and which had caused rising cases from some countries with greater levels of infection than we had. And whilst I think it would have been impossible to kind of keep infection out of this country completely from other sources because of our reliance on goods coming in from other countries, my view was that where there was clear evidence of an increased risk in a particular country, and the ability for that country to then amplify what was already happening here, is that we should take action against that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go briefly to something I think we'll cover with other witnesses, but upon which you make a very helpful, that's the concept of zero COVID around this time. This is a fairly well-known concept that around the time, I think probably summer of 2020, the cases had come very significantly down in Scotland. And the narrative, certainly from the Scottish Government, is that that is associated with this strategy of easing the lockdown more slowly, which was successful in that it got cases down to a much lower level. And there were a number of statements made, including by the First Minister, and indeed by other academics who were involved in advising the government, that zero COVID elimination was a feasible option and was indeed a laudable goal. One of the things that we have struggled with is whether this was actually ever a policy, and it may be a matter of semantics, but in your witness statement at paragraph 479, you helpfully say that your position on the matter is that, in my view, it would have been impossible to achieve a zero COVID strategy without strict controls of every land, sea and air border, alongside quarantine and high levels of cooperation of the public in adhering to restrictions in place. Regional cooperation in trying to achieve this aim, and most likely a wider degree of cooperation than UK nations alone, may have made this slightly more likely, but with a high dependency on these borders for essential goods and materials, it would have been very difficult even with this. So, for the reasons we were just exploring to an extent, and I assume also the land border with England as a part of this, your view was that although elimination as an ultimate goal was a good thing because it would mean suppression of the virus down to low levels at the very least, elimination was not something that could ever have been achieved. Is that right, broadly? So
I think elimination was used as a term, sometimes colloquially rather than scientifically. And certainly from a scientific perspective, looking at epidemiology, I didn't think that elimination of the virus was a feasible option. However, if it led to an approach which tried to keep the numbers as low as possible, then I think that was something which was useful and something which was worth pursuing. Zero COVID, as far as I'm concerned, was never a formal policy of the Scottish Government, but keeping the cases and the harm which was caused by those cases to as low a level as possible was something which we've stated in many documents. If we touch upon the environment, the circumstances that would have been necessary to achieve zero COVID, I really do think that it would have been almost impossible for Scotland to be able to achieve that as a country by itself. Even on a UK level, I think that would have been a very difficult thing to try to achieve despite the fact we're an island nation, but perhaps because we're an island nation and are so reliant on things coming from outside, but with greater level of regional cooperation and probably at a European level, I do believe that we could have sustained lower levels of COVID, perhaps not eliminated, but certainly got very close to that and dealt with sporadic cases, much as we do with other diseases such as measles.
Was your view on the matter, which I've set out and you've helpfully added to, a matter on which you provided advice to the First Minister and other ministers at that time?
It was a discussion that we had on a regular basis.
Yes. That was your position,
and I think it was well recognised that was my position. And I wrote one or two pieces on it, some of which appeared in popular media as well.
Was there an appreciation at that time that the use of the concept of zero COVID or elimination in public pronouncements may, as other witnesses, including Professor Stephen Reicher, suggest in their evidence to the inquiry, create the impression amongst the public that effectively COVID is over and we can go about our business as normal?
I'm not sure that the public would ever have believed that was ever a possibility at that stage in time, given the kind of fear and anxiety that existed within the general population. And I think everybody, certainly that I knew of, was constantly watching both the UK and international picture to see where the next threat might arrive from. But I do think it was useful in terms of achieving a collective response from society with an aim to try to reduce the harm as much as possible across society. It touches upon the point that Mr. Reicher has spoken about on several occasions, which actually appealing to the altruistic nature of humans and that collective societal response. And I think one of the things that it was helpful in doing in that respect was actually giving them an aim round about which we could try to coalesce.
But it was a scientifically unachievable aim, isn't that right?
I think that elimination, as it's defined scientifically, is something which would have been almost impossible to achieve.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about some brief questions, I hope, about the slightly later period. Obviously, as we've discussed, evidence suggested, which we've analysed with statisticians, that cases started to go up in August. We've talked about the reasons for that. On the 7th of September, the First Minister announced that there would be a slowing down of the easing of restrictions because of this, and consideration was given in light of advice that had been tendered by SAGE, about which we've already heard evidence in Module 2, that there might be, by the time of September, a circuit breaker or fire break lockdown to try and break this increasing trend. In around, on the 18th of September, you submitted an advice paper along with the Chief Nursing Officer and Professor Leach, the National Clinical Director, which can be found at INQ 000326427. I'm looking at page 4, paragraphs 21 and 22. So this was an example of a situation in which you appear to be providing written advice, but along with your colleagues who are providing a sort of joint opinion, if you like. And just as we're getting that up, this was a suggestion. This was effectively, you were looking at various options, various things that you might do. And the conclusion, I think, is reasonably expressed in these paragraphs where you say, however, we do not believe these measures are sufficient. You've listed a whole load of potential measures immediately before that in a bullet point list. Therefore, we recommend that we introduce a general stay-at-home order for 14 days from the 12th of October. We fully acknowledge the seriousness of this, and we have discussed at some length whether we could still recommend a less stringent fire break. Ministers will decide whether there should be specific exemptions from a four harms. Could we just have that back down to the original thing? And over the page. Perspective. From a public health perspective, to have the fire break effect, we require the most decisive action. Could I take you to another document, please, which is INQ 000326426. I'm looking on page 1 at paragraph 6. This is an advice, again, by the three of you, which is issued, it appears, later that very same day, where you say, we remain of the view that a fire break amounting to a general stay-at-home order may be required to be implemented quickly if our recommended measures do not have the desired effect. We do not propose at this stage a planned fire break during October school holidays, but such a step may be required. With or without a fire break, we may have to consider tightening travel restrictions further during that period to reduce circulation of the virus. So it looks like an advice was given that there should be a fire break, and then later on a shorter advice was tendered the same day by the same three people, which moves the position slightly. We were interested in exploring with you why it was that the advice that was being tendered had changed in that apparently significant fashion over the course of that day.
So the only reason that that might have happened is in terms of drafting and the strength of the recommendation that all three advisors were content with. It's the only way that I could assume that that would happen.
But it does look like there's a significant change. You say there's decisive action, quite forceful, and you recognise that it might be resisted, I think. And then your position becomes that you're no longer recommending within the course of it. So it's not just a tweak. So are you saying that the first advice didn't reflect your opinion and the second advice did, or what happened over the course of it?
What I'm saying is that it appears that in that, if that is the order, and I don't particularly remember this submission that went up. But occasionally the process of drafting those submissions would be drafted by other people, and we would comment on them, on the language that was used, and if we were unhappy at the language that was used in them, we would change them.
So you changed it from
whether it reflected our position or not.
So you changed it from you should have a fire break lockdown to you should not have a fire break lockdown.
I don't think that's what it says.
Well, what is the change?
It says
we do not propose at this
during
stage
the October school holidays. So it's the timing of it rather than whether it might be necessary. So
are you suggesting it continued to be the position that there should be a fire break lockdown?
But such a step may be required.
But not at that time?
But not immediately at that time.
But decisive action had been required in accordance with the previous advice?
So, as I say, the only reason that may have been included would have been in the drafting of the submission from whichever source, which clearly the three advisors have not agreed to.
So did the first advice go to ministers?
It doesn't seem so. I wouldn't have thought so.
So the first advice is drafted, and you say that somebody, one of your number, decided that they didn't like the advice as it was drafted. What was your opinion? Did you recommend a fire break at that stage, or didn't you?
So what I recall at that stage was that it was, I don't remember the exact dates, but I remember the discussions around about we were heading towards requiring some sort of firmer action, and the timing of that firmer action was to be determined. Some of it was determined by the modelling, and there was still hope that the October school holidays might influence and bring down things naturally. We very often found that during periods where schools were not in session, is that influenced.
Did you advise a fire break, or was it one of your colleagues who advised a fire break in the first advice?
I have to say to you that I don't know where that first advice came from. And so what I'm saying to you is I can only assume that that's how it's been drafted, and that it has been altered when the three chief advisors have looked at it. The process of drafting submissions was very often done by policy officials who interpreted our position, and from some of the conversations that we had.
You can't interpret. We say we need a fire break now. That's not interpretation, Professor, is it? That's straightforward. Either that's what they understood you were saying. It's just not interpretation. It's quite a dramatic change.
It's the only way that I can think that has happened. But
sorry for interrupting, Mr. Dawson.
Not at all. This is potentially quite complicated. But what we did was we looked at the advice, and then we compared and contrasted what the advice was with what we thought the actual outcome was. And this was quite an interesting illustration where you then go on to tell us in this advice, having said we now or we do not, I should say, recommend a fire break lockdown, that various things should in fact happen to try and reduce R below zero, strengthen facts, etc., etc. So we did a comparison here. I won't go through the detail of it, obviously, but as a broad proposition, what appears then to happen is that in this list, which goes on a bit further than one can see there and over the page, some of the things which you recommend with your colleagues should be done are accepted and some are not. And the basic question is, in circumstances where, having come to the view that there should not be a fire break lockdown by this point, and then having come up with what I assume is quite a carefully planned series of things to try and work out, well, what's the best thing, where is the virus coming from, what do we need to do? And in the circumstances where what eventually happens is some of them are accepted and some of them are not. In these sorts of circumstances, would you ever have the opportunity, having tendered this written advice, to discuss with the ultimate decision makers which bits they really should keep in and which bits they should jettison? Of course, they are, as you have said on a number of occasions, taking into account a number of different factors and harms. But to what extent is there a system whereby in that list you're able to say to them, but if you're going to do anything, you absolutely have to do that, but if you're going to not do that, that's okay, that's not going to make much difference? Because it seemed to us to be slightly odd that some of the things are accepted and some are not, without, as far as we can tell from the paperwork, any further discussion about what the most important elements from a harm one perspective actually are.
Yeah. So there's probably two things I would want to kind of emphasise in this. The first of all is that there's a full realisation that the role of an advisor, whether it be a health advisor, an economic advisor or so forth, is simply that, is to provide advice, and that advice is received and acted upon according to how the decision maker wants them. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect was my experience whenever one of these submissions was sent to the decision makers, to the ministers, to speak about, they would then organise a call, either in person or at the very least using a video platform, to discuss the advice that was contained within it. And there would then be a back and forwards in relation, just as you described, about what were the particularly important elements of it, or to explore some of the reasoning behind the proposal in further detail. And that was a process which we became very used to all the way through the pandemic. But very, very regularly, a submission such as this would then provoke a kind of call of some sort or a meeting of some sort to discuss the advice further.
And did that happen on this occasion?
I don't recall any occasions when it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm. There's no document. This is very clearly set out as to what your position was. Mm-hmm. We're not aware of there being any documentation we've seen about that process. So you're saying that's an oral process where a meeting take place and you go
it was an oral process, yeah. Right.
Because, for example, just to look at these things, for example, the strengthen facts message, we think that did happen, but limit unnecessary domestic and foreign travel didn't. So other things like non-essential car sharing did come in, but restricting non-essential travel to 30 miles limit did not. Other measures that did not included a message to underline the seriousness of the situation, protecting the NHS, preserving care. That did not happen. So would you have sat down with the decision maker and gone through every element to make sure that they were pushing the emphasis on the right parts? And how does the public know what that process involved?
So I don't remember the particular conversation that relates to this paper, because there were so many conversations which happened which were similar to this. But generally what it would involve is looking at the proposals which were contained within the submission and walking through them as to what we thought that they would achieve, and again taking into account the advice from other parts of government as well as to what potential harms they might cause as well. I think I have to convey that this was all part of that four harms approach, where we were looking at the impacts in society as a whole, rather than simply just as a health impact.
Thank you. So moving into a different later period, I'd just like to ask you broadly what really one area. We've seen in the evidence that from around August 2021, from around July 2021, there was a significant increase in cases in Scotland, I think associated with the Delta variant, and that because the Omicron variant then arrived towards the end of the year and then quickly became the dominant strain, effectively Scottish infection cases remained very high over that period. We've also explored that over that third wave period, there was very nearly as much mortality in Scotland, despite the impression that Omicron is a less virulent strain of COVID, as there had been in both waves 1 and 2. There was roughly 5,000 deaths in the first, 5,000 in the second, and about 4,000 in the third. Over that period might be said to be characterised by very much less stringent restrictions. The main protection, it would appear, against the virus being the vaccine, as you have said earlier, and in particular the vaccine passport system, although it had a different name in Scotland. That was what Ms Lamb told us it subsequently became known as. Over that period, given your predominant responsibility for providing advice on harms 1 and 2, to what extent were you providing advice that more needed to be done to address harm 1, greater restrictions needed to be applied, and that the vaccine and the vaccine passport were clearly not protecting the people of Scotland?
So during that period, one of the most important things was, as you say, that we had a greater level of protection from both vaccine and therapeutics. So there were multiple medications that we could now use to treat people who had become ill, and the vaccine was proving that it was able to offer particular protection against the most severe consequences of COVID, particularly against mortality and serious illness. What it was able to do less well was to reduce transmission, although it did have an impact on transmission as well. And in terms of the vaccine certification or passport, as it became known as, whilst I was supportive generally of the approach, I would have preferred to see a slightly more stringent approach which was deployed in relation to it. And I gave advice that actually vaccination by itself wasn't sufficient to render an environment safe, and but that vaccination plus testing in combination would certainly give an additional degree of protection.
So were there measures that you suggested should be imposed, further restrictions over that period that were not?
I don't recall the specific detail, but I remember during that period there were times when I would have been more content if a stronger position had been adopted to protect some of the environments where we knew that transmission was likely to take place. So by that point, it was very well established that indoor places with poor ventilation, where people were coming together, were likely to be places where transmission was much more likely to occur. And if we were going to kind of use vaccine certification in that environment, also testing at the same time as relying on vaccination would have given an additional degree of protection. But there wasn't that level of testing, is that what you're suggesting? Yeah. So given your responsibility and that position, you would have provided advice that that was necessary? I recall doing that, yeah. Thank you. Could I just ask you one final question? It's about one of the helpful lessons learned and recommendations that you've set out. In paragraph 720 of the report, you talk about the pandemic, in common with many others, reflected and in many cases exacerbated existing inequalities. Research on where their disparities were, what their causes were, and how best to reduce them needed to begin from the outset of the pandemic. A wide range of qualitative and quantitative research methods were needed to understand disparities. Continual dialogue with local communities was important in understanding risks and vulnerabilities, and to co-design effective responses at a hyper-local level that may not be picked up in larger national data sets or research. So I think here you're addressing a theme about which we have heard a considerable amount of evidence. Is it correct to say that you're accepting there that there wasn't enough done to understand the way in which the pandemic was exacerbating existing inequalities, and that that is a matter which not only could have been done better during the pandemic, but must be done better in future? So the whole issue of health inequalities is one which I think is worth exploring in quite a bit of detail, because just in terms of lessons learned, one of the most important things that we as a nation could do in order to prepare ourselves for the inevitable next pandemic which we face is to raise the health of all the population, to make it a much more health resilient nation and population in terms of meeting whichever disease comes to us in pandemic form in the future. To do that, we need to understand the nature of health inequalities, and we need to prioritise action against health inequalities that exists within our society. So both during the pandemic and outside the pandemic, spending as much time and research as possible to understand the impact on people's lives of those inequalities that they face and how that impacts on their health is something which I think is incredibly important. We see it in society even before the pandemic came, is that health inequalities were stark. I see a renewed focus since the pandemic in terms of trying to address some of those health inequalities, and we should be very, very clear that the way that we address those is not through a healthcare related model, but actually is through a kind of cross-government, all-society approach in terms of what we understand by inequality across society. And if we can do that, if we can improve both the economic and social capital of communities, that leads to kind of better level of health within all these communities, I think that we'll be in a far stronger position to be able to meet disease X when it appears in the next pandemic.
That's a very laudable aim, if I may say so, Professor, but is your position that that did not happen sufficiently during the pandemic?
I think attempts were made to do that, and it was often very difficult to get the right data and information to understand exactly how it impacted on particular communities. I think changes were made during the course of the pandemic which helped us to understand better. I think it's worth singling out the huge efforts which were made, albeit slower than I think people would have liked to have seen it, to understand the impact on particular BAME communities and those who had lived with disabilities of one sort or another. I think although strides were made during the course of the pandemic to understand that better, preparing ourselves so that we've got much better data resources that relate to some of these communities and characteristics is going to be really important for us to concentrate.
Were those data sources at least lacking in the pandemic?
I think they were lacking at the beginning of the pandemic, yes. I think they were developed over the course of the pandemic, but certainly at the beginning I don't think that they were as strong as they subsequently became.
Thank you very much. Excuse me just one second. Those are my questions, and there are no co-participant questions as I understand it.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. Thank you for your help and for being here virtually all day.
Thank you.
The next witness is Professor Sheila Rowan, and my learned friend Mrs. Arledge will be asking a question.
Musical chairs.
After me, please. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Sorry you've been kept waiting for so long.
It's okay.
You're Professor Sheila Rowan.
I am.
I'm going to ask you, please. Oh, sorry. I'm going to ask you to do it. I'm going to ask for your witness statement dated the 14th of November. Someone's already ahead of me. It's INQ 000274012. Hopefully that comes up on your screen.
It does.
And is that a familiar document to you?
It is.
Thank you. And you, between 2016 and June 2021, you were the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Scottish Government. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you were, your successor in that role was Julie Fitzpatrick from the date of you leaving. I should say, my lady, that there is a witness statement from Professor Fitzpatrick, which is INQ 000352847. Not going to bring it up on screen, but that's for reference. You were seconded, Professor Rowan, from the University of Glasgow for 3 days a week to carry out the Chief Scientific Advisor role for Scottish Government. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you hold the chair, I think still do, natural philosophy at that university.
I do.
And in fact, during your time of secondment, you remained an employee of the University of Glasgow rather than an employee of the Scottish Government. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Just in terms of clarifying the position, is it right that your role, and not a criticism, but your role as Chair of Philosophy doesn't have any direct relevance in terms of scientific knowledge about the pandemic, for instance?
So my professional background is that indeed I'm a professor of physics. However, I would add that I bring with that 20 years of experience in working in and leading interdisciplinary teams to solve difficult scientific challenges, and importantly for the CSA role, a very wide range of professional networks across all scientific areas.
Because your role is to bring together, as the Chief Scientific Advisor, is to bring in knowledge from different sources and act as a sort of central figurehead point to bring those matters together. Is that right?
Yes, as Chief Scientific Advisor, one of the prerequisites for the role is to be able to access scientific expertise across all domains in science. So coming in with a very wide network of contacts enables ministers or officials to use the CSA across cross-cutting science areas.
And it's about, effectively, knowing the right people to ask the right questions of the right time because of your expertise in that cross-cutting role.
Absolutely. Utilising those wide networks.
And presumably those wide networks are across the research world. It's not simply limited to, for instance, the University of Glasgow or whichever university you happened to be employed with at that particular time.
No, indeed, they're very wide networks. They cross, as I say, all scientific disciplines, certainly not institution-specific nor discipline-specific, and so a very, very wide range of areas.
And it's not a dissimilar role in that respect to the Chief Scientific Advisor in Westminster in terms of the inquiry's already heard evidence about his particular expertise, but that was simply that he happened to be that person in the role at that particular time. He's not appointed to be the scientific advisor who gives all of the advice about everything. He brings that thing together, he brings that data together and the expertise together. So in that respect, your role is not dissimilar from the UK Chief Scientific Advisor.
So there are both similarities and differences to the role. The similarities are certainly, and I think this is quite important, that there is no requirement for either the UK Government Chief Science Advisor or the Scottish Government Chief Science Advisor to come from a particular discipline. They can be from any discipline, and in both nations, historically, have come from a wide variety of backgrounds.
And you mentioned the cross-cutting role that you play. By that, do you mean that it's part of your role to have eyes on the science across Scottish Government and across the country and your areas of science across the system rather than drilling into one specific area every day?
So it's about being there to be a resource who can be consulted on any particular science area, and then knowing where to access the expertise to draw out the evidence, draw out the information, such that government can use that.
Now, one difference is your secondment is 3 days a week.
Yep.
Was 3 days a week. Was that the case throughout the pandemic as well as in normal times?
So it was formally the case throughout the pandemic, although obviously during that time I prioritised matters for Scottish Government and reorganised my time accordingly. So although that was formally the case, I did during that time spend more time on pandemic matters than other things.
Because the reality is that it was a fast-moving situation, and asking the right questions at the right time of the right people was no doubt a full-time job.
Correct. It was of course a fast-moving time, and I prioritised my efforts accordingly.
And your role as Chief Scientific Advisor sat at the time of your role, I understand, within the Directorate for Education, Communities and Justice, and then subsequently the Director for Education and Justice. Is that right?
That's correct.
It was subsequently, I think, transferred to the Directorate of Economy. Do you have any insight into why the role sat where it did and why it was moved?
So I think there's a certain so I don't know, first of all, the reasons why the CSA role or who made the decision to position it in education and justice during my tenure. That was a decision made before I took up the role. I would say there's a certain logic to having it there in that it's adjacent to the higher education and science part of Scottish Government. Understandably, that science and research area is one in which the CSA has interest, but I don't know the specific reasons for why it was there nor why it was moved.
And when you took up the role, dealing just very briefly, appreciating that you took up the role in 2016, but when you took up the role at that time, I think you say in your statement that the post had been vacant for about 18 months beforehand.
That's correct.
And I think you accept that as a result, that did mean there were gaps in the advisory system that existed and was set up. Of course, by the time the pandemic came along, you'd been in post for some time. You set up, I think, a scientific advice framework as well to sort of, is it right to say that you're sort of codifying how science should be accessed across Scottish Government?
That's so. When I took up the role, I did indeed work with colleagues in my support team and indeed reached out across the government to understand its scientific advisory needs. And together we put together a framework, as you say, which gave a guide to the principles that policy officials can use to access scientific advice in government.
Because if there's already a source of science within government, for instance, there's already a scientist dealing with a particular issue, probably doesn't require so much outside engagement or outside research if there's already a framework in place, but equally there will be elements that are not covered by effectively embedded scientists in various departments.
That's right. So what the principles of that framework say are, if there is a domain-specific need and there is a domain expert, a topic expert in Scottish Government, they would be a good first port of call to refer to. In addition to that, they also say quite clearly where there is no expert in an area in Scottish Government, you can use the CSA to help source scientific advice based on the cross-cutting nature of the CSA role and its ability to reach out widely across topic areas. And
in doing so, was part of your role to sort of advise on the right questions to ask when people were coming to you for, where do I go and ask this question? Was it also part and parcel of the role to help formulate the questions that were being put?
I would say less to help formulate the questions being put, but to help people understand what a constructive question looks like in terms of scientific advice, so that they could get useful answers back.
And then did your role also involve interpreting the answers that came back as necessary?
Can I check? Do you mean answers back?
So when the questions had been given to whichever advisor, whichever scientist, whichever group that had got, and a paper comes back, were you involved in the interpretation, assisting in the interpretation of that paper where necessary?
When necessary, again, that, and specifically during the pandemic, I would say as CSA, I had 2 key roles, one of which was indeed in attending SAGE, potentially being a point of contact between the Scottish system and SAGE, in terms of SAGE advice and how that might feed into the Scottish system and have a Scottish lens applied to it. And the other one was, again, the ability to, if needed, identify who an expert might be to help.
Turning to sort of more specific experience of the pandemic and your role therein, so we learned from your witness statement, paragraph 36 on page 11, that you were brought into the room, as it were, in terms of Covid-19 January 2020 as a result of that SAGE meeting on January 2022. Sorry, 2nd of January, 22nd of January 2020, too many twos. And you attended that meeting, you were invited to that meeting as CSA for Scotland.
No, that's not correct. So the meeting on 22nd of January 2020 was a precautionary SAGE meeting with a very small, limited number of attendees, and that predated my attendance at SAGE.
So you went, is it right then to say that you went to the first formal SAGE meeting, as it were, rather than the precautionary SAGE meeting?
No, there were a series of SAGE meetings between January throughout February, March onwards, and the first SAGE meeting at which I was a formal attendee was in April.
Why the gap?
Sure. So, as we've discussed, the role of the framework for science advice in Scottish Government indicates that when there is a topic relevant need, in this case associated with the pandemic, that would be for public health advice, medical and clinical advice, the first port of call, the person who would take the lead on that advice, would be the Chief Medical Officer, not the Chief Scientific Advisor. So I did have a role during that time, but it was not to lead on the public health advice.
Did that run the risk, at least, of you not having sufficient eyes across that cross-cutting element in the early days of the pandemic in terms of emerging knowledge and the fast-moving pace and the various threads that had to be pulled together?
So I would say no. The way the system works is that the SAGE advice formally comes to the Chief Scientific Advisor, as I was then, and my office. So we're cited on each of the SAGE minutes. The minutes form the advice. So that cite was there, and my role was to ensure that those were passed quickly to SCORE, the Scottish Government Resilience Room, who have the formal responsibility of coordinating emergency response, so that they could access the relevant topic experts, which in this case, as I say, would be the Chief Medical Officer and colleagues in health resilience. And during that time, the predominant need was for public health advice during the January, February, March period. I would say, having seen and indeed reviewed the SAGE minutes, it was only by sort of March and then into April that it became clear that the scale and kind of response needed was going to be wider than strictly public health, virology, epidemiology, and that wider expertise could be needed, and that's the point at which I started to attend SAGE.
So March, April time was the first time that the sort of cross-cutting element of your role came to the fore. Is that fair?
That's correct, and again, to help understand that, if you look at the SAGE attendees, I think in April, Professor Kath Noakes started as a SAGE attendee. She's a mechanical engineer. That's a topic that might not naturally come to mind when considering pandemic response. But the recognition was surfacing that wider expertise, cross-cutting expertise, could well be important in the response, and so that's where my role, again, can serve.
Because Professor Noakes, as a mechanical engineer, was talking about like aerosolization and or the risk of particles and how the virus might be spread through the air, and obviously others were talking about how the virus might be spread through touch points and the like. And that brings together, that's a good example, is it, of mechanical engineer being able to look at it from a slightly different angle, perhaps.
Bring her expertise in fluid dynamics and the built environment and the engineering of buildings to bring that expertise to bear, and she played an important role.
When you sort of became more involved in the sort of cross-cutting role, March, April time, what discussions were you having both at that time and before that with the then Chief Medical Officer about the focus, what could be brought to bear from other aspects in Scottish Government away from just the pure CMO approach?
So I would say up until March, April, the response was very focused on clinical, medical, epidemiological needs, and so I did discuss with the then CMO, Catherine Calderwood, the expertise that she wished to draw on in putting together the Covid-19 advisory group, which, through its terms of reference, is constituted, it's still mostly in that response space, because that was still the primary need, was the public health response and associated areas. But she requested that I attend and was a member of the Covid-19 advisory group, and that brought that ability to reach out further if needed. But the terms of reference of that group were still mostly in the public health area. I performed the link to wider expertise. And when,
I think in your statement, paragraph 24, you talk about this being set up even before the pandemic, but you also had this, had CSA, Four Nations CSA discussions and meetings, and when did they start to ramp up in the context of pandemic matters?
So the CSAs met weekly, actually, throughout the entire tenure of my time as CSA. So that predated anything to do with the pandemic. And those particular Four Nations CSA meetings, so that's the CSAs of the UK government departments, plus the UK government CSA, plus me as the Scottish and also the Welsh CSA, the topic of those meetings was, again, wide. That's the ability to have cross-cutting discussions, not actually necessarily about pandemic response. Those could be about cross-cutting topics. So they were not focused on developing advice for the pandemic. The CSAs could receive updates on the progress of the pandemic, but they served a different purpose, and I would say were extremely effective in building and maintaining contacts between the CSAs across, again, a wide range of backgrounds, and formed one of the networks of expertise that we could all access.
In terms of, so you spoke about SCAG and the setting that up, and your role in that. You attended SCAG, didn't you? And you then also attended a series of subgroups. The inquiries heard, and will continue to hear, lots of evidence about SCAG more broadly. So what I would like to do right now is just very briefly drill down into some of the detail of the subgroups that you were on.
Sure.
You were on the education and children's issues subgroup.
That's correct.
And then you were also on the university and colleges subgroup.
That's correct. Very briefly, it formed only shortly before I came to the end of my time as CSA.
That's exactly the sort of question I was going to come to. It formed May 2021, somewhere around then. Inquiries heard, and we'll no doubt continue to hear about evidence about issues surrounding university students in late 2020 and the concern that the return of students to university and close quarters in university halls of residence and the like were driving pandemic figures in late 2020 as the term returned, the students returned to school, to university. If the university's subgroup wasn't set up until May 2021, who was giving advice to the Scottish Government about those sorts of very specific but quite high-profile matters that were feeding into Scottish Government decision-making?
So I think it's an important point to realise that SAGE performs an advisory role for the whole of the UK. And throughout the pandemic, SAGE remained the core source of scientific advice for all of the nations. The Scottish Government COVID Advisory Group was not redoing SAGE's work, not duplicating SAGE's work. It was simply applying a Scottish lens to the advice that was coming from SAGE and adding in local information to help advise Scottish Government. So even without the formation of an universities and further education subgroup, SAGE could provide a core source of scientific advice for all the nations.
So what then prompted the subgroup to be set up in May 2021?
So I'm afraid the setting up of the subgroup would really be a matter probably for the CMO to answer, because each of these subgroups, when they formed, fed in through the Scottish Government COVID Advisory Group to then provide a source of advice for the CMO.
You also attended the schools and education group. So were you the only person to be on all three, on attending SCAG main event, the main SCAG, and those two subgroups?
No, I think Professor Carol Tannehill, who chaired the education subgroup, and I think subsequently, originally the university subgroup, also then attended the main Scottish Government COVID Advisory Group to maintain links between those entities. I was, however, the only attendee on the education and children's subgroup who also attended SAGE.
Which is good. So again, was this an example of your cross-cutting function as well, and the links that you can build up in your role?
Exactly. So again, this is an area where the CSA can act to perform a role in linking different science areas and attending SAGE, then be able to help that subgroup access the underlying evidence from SAGE or indeed elsewhere in my network to inform the discussions of the subject experts on that group.
A different element of your cross-cutting role, I think, the Chiefs Group from mid-2020. If we can have your statement up, please, at page 3. It might even be page 4 because it's paragraph 10 and 13. My apologies. Hang on. That's not the reference I have. Anyway, we can do it without the statement, don't worry. There comes a point in mid-2020 when you say it was recognised that there was no, although there were all these different groups available, what there wasn't necessarily was a single area or single forum for the Scottish Government advisors to collectively come together and to communicate each of their own individual expertise in a small group setting. Is that right?
That's correct.
And is that what sort of prompted the institution of what's known as the Chiefs Group?
Yes. So there were fora in which combinations of the chief advisors would be present, be understanding the different roles that one another were performing and discuss that. There was no forum, no one forum where all the chief advisors met and could share information about ongoing commissions, take a strategic look at what future advice might be needed, and then collectively have that understanding of what one another were doing. So, you know, science advice certainly was proceeding strongly. I would say the most useful role of that group was simply information sharing, so that each advisor then could go off and do their own job.
And was there a concern or potential concern that effectively, because different groups were meeting separately, that there was a risk that information might fall between the gaps, as it were, because of the fast-moving nature of the pandemic?
So I'd no reason to believe that anything was falling between the gaps. However, you can always make things better. And so putting that group in place, just put in place an additional forum in which we could all be cited on one another's activity, and the utility of that exercise was such that I believe some form of that group continues.
If we just very briefly have up on screen INQ 000321345. I think this is the original proposal, as it were, for setting up the Chiefs group.
So this is a document that I have not seen in preparation.
It's not. I'm not going to ask you any detail of the granularity about it, and I can apologise. I apologise for that. But can I just, if we look at page 3, this is, I think, sort of summing up what you've just said in many ways. But paragraph 10, bringing together small body of groups of advisors to lead the forward planning to ensure that advice can be delivered, liaising with colleagues in the government as appropriate, and this would help to identify when new thematic sectoral subgroups should be established and advise on their membership. Is it right that as time moved on, this ended up, instead of it being a body that the idea of ministers coming to the group and sort of commissioning further advice, commissioning further investigations or studies or policy papers to be provided, is it right that in fact what happened in reality was it just gave a more focal point, a visibility? I think you say in your statement that it created it helped to increase the visibility of the sources of information across Scottish Government, rather than being a direct sort of advisory body in itself. Is that fair?
The group could have been commissioned to directly provide advice to ministers. It did not, in my time, operate in that way. As I've said, it essentially allowed internal visibility and information sharing of the activities of the different chief advisors with one another.
Would it have improved the group? Would it have improved access to information across government had it had more of a commissioning, had more involved in the role that it could have had?
So I'm afraid that that's a question I don't have the insight to answer for you.
Fair enough. Then I have nothing further for you. Let me just bend over and see if there's anything. Thank you very much. My lady, do you have anything?
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much, Professor. I hope you have a safe journey back to Glasgow. I hope the trains are running again, are they?
I hope so too.
Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Grateful. Thank you.